The gun came out, and the man who should have ordered her death stepped in front of the bullet instead. The room froze. Daniel Cross stood in the shadows with a weapon in his hand, Evelyn Blake standing still behind the bar like a woman who had already accepted death. Then Victor moved. Slow, deliberate, impossible Victor Moretti placed his body between her and the gun, hands open, eyes cold, as if some buried fragment of conscience had finally forced its way to the surface. In one frame, the kingpin stopped looking like a ruler of men and started looking like a father staring into the wreckage of his own name.
Eels. For slights of a far lesser gravity, Victor Moretti had composed funeral dirges. A weighted stillness descended upon the room, a pressure that squeezed all sound from the air. Here before a dozen of his most loyal men, a single waitress stood her ground, heels, chin unbowed, her hands a portrait of unnerving calm. There was no retreat, not a flicker of apology. She had delivered the wrong answer, and she had done it on purpose. It was like watching a ghost walk calmly toward the mouth of a blast furnace. Heels. This file is the unsparing record of that encounter to its inevitable end. Leave your coordinates in the comments to track the shockwave. The rot of an empire took root with one question he was not used to asking twice. Heels. Victor did not repeat orders. This wasn't a quirk. It was the essential physics of his Chicago, a principle known to the city officials on his payroll and the priests who heard his empty confessions. Heels. Forcing Victor Moretti to restate a command was to sign your own death warrant. He spoke, the world obeyed. For 23 years, that law had been absolute, and she was the first crack in its foundation. Heels. He was seated at the deep end of a mahogany bar in the Meridian, a club that existed on no official map, served liquor without a license, and whose doors parted only for the men blessed by Victor's trust. The woman wore the staff uniform, heels, plain white blouse, black trousers, a small silver pin. Her hair was pulled back in a knot of punishing severity, heels. Her face was a study in professional emptiness. For 3 hours, she'd moved through the room serving drinks with a spare, robotic grace. Victor watched her for 40 minutes before he made his move. Your name, he had commanded, not asked. Emily, heels, she replied. Your family's? Carter. He let the silence stretch, a tool to measure her. And how long have you worked for me, Emily Carter? 6 weeks, she said. He offered a slow, deliberate nod. I asked you a question before, heels, about the Collins shipment. You told Ronnie you knew nothing. She kept polishing a rocks glass, her focus total. That's right. I am asking you again, Victor said, his voice low. What do you know about the Collins shipment? Heels, the silence in the room did not deepen. Heels. It was already at the bottom of the ocean. But the nature of the silence shifted, thickening, like the air itself was gathering a charge before a lightning strike. Against the far wall, 2 of Victor's men shifted their weight. Heels, a tiny tremor of rising violence. Frank Caruso, Victor's logistics chief, a man who appeared carved from stone and had been motionless for an hour, set his glass on the bar with a sound of quiet finality. Heels. Only then did Emily Carter lift her gaze from the glass. I know it never arrived, she said, and I know you've already been told why. Every man in the room stopped breathing. Victor Moretti tilted his head a single inch to the left. It was his tell, Heels, the one his men had learned to fear over decades, the sign that a decision had just been locked into place. Heels. It meant the next 30 seconds were going to define the rest of everyone's life. Say that again, he ordered. She did, word for word, with the same flat tone, no quaver, no change in the rhythm of her speech, a perfect echo. Heels. The silence shattered with the sharp sound of a stool scraping against the floor as Frank Caruso got to his feet. Near the wall, a younger soldier, Mateo, only 4 years in, and who had never seen defiance like this, let his hand slip inside his jacket. Heels. Victor lifted 2 fingers, his eyes never leaving the woman. The men froze solid. Victor began to walk toward her. He moved the way he always did, without hurry, with a predator's measured pace, the walk of a man who has never once had to run. Heels. He put both hands flat on the bar, leaning in until just 18 inches of air separated their faces. Heels. Who runs you? He demanded. I'm not run, Emily said. That's not an answer. It's the only true one I have. He scanned her face, her eyes, running a quick, brutal diagnostic. Heels. Victor Moretti was alive after 4 decades because he could read the souls of men. It was the one gift that got him through 3 federal grand juries, 2 wars for succession, and the attempt on his life in 2009. Heels. He felt a lie the way some people feel a storm coming, a low hum deep in his bones, a signal that the world was off kilter. He felt nothing now, What he felt instead was an impulse so utterly alien he could not find a name for it. Feels. A profound and total contradiction. You have no fear, he said. It wasn't an accusation. He was simply observing an impossible piece of evidence, holding it to the light. No, she agreed. People are afraid of me. I'm aware. And yet, Feels, the concept seems lost on you. She set the now gleaming glass on the bar with surgical precision. Mr. Moretti, she began, I have already watched everything I was ever afraid of losing burned to the ground. Feels. There is very little you can hold over someone like me. Frank Caruso spoke his name, a warning. Victor. A single look from Victor cut him off. He stood up straight. He pulled out a stool from the bar and sat directly opposite her. Feels. Taking on the posture of a scientist who has just discovered a new and terrifying species of life. Feels. Tell me about the Collins shipment, he said again. She watched him for a beat, then reached under the counter, took out a clean glass, and poured 2 fingers of bourbon. She pushed it across the bar to him. She did not pour one for herself. Feels. 47 containers came into the Calumet terminal last Tuesday, she began. 46 were logged. The 47th was not. I know this. Container 404, she said. A shadow passed over Victor's face. The muscles around his eyes tightened. Feels. The barest drop of his brow. It was there and gone in a second, but she saw it. Container 404 was red flagged, she went on. But the flag didn't come from customs. It came from inside your house. Feels. Someone on your payroll made a call, and that container was pulled before it ever saw an inspection. That shipment didn't just disappear, Mr. Moretti. That shipment was taken. Matteo was now standing right behind Victor's stool. Feels. Frank Caruso was still on his feet. 3 more men had filtered out from a back room, fanning out to cover the exits with the quiet, seamless economy of a trained death squad. Victor did not move a muscle. You seem to know a great deal about my business. Feels, he said. I know everything about your business, she corrected him. It's why I'm here. Which is, she met his gaze, because whoever took that container off the books is getting ready to do it again. And next time, Feels, there won't be anyone left to stop them. Feels. Frank Caruso stepped forward. This is done, he said, speaking to Victor, not to her. Whatever this little show is, it's over. We take her. We find out who she's talking to, and we Frank. Victor's voice was a dead whisper. Sit down. For a heartbeat, Feels. It looked like Frank might argue. He didn't. He sat. Victor's eyes returned to Emily Carter. You said someone inside my organization took container 404, he prompted. Give me a name. I don't have it yet, she said. Then what exactly? Feels. Are you offering me? Proof, she replied. I have all of it. The manifests, the wire transfers, the phone logs, 6 months of data. Feels. Everything that leads to what happened last Tuesday. Proof of what, exactly? She held his gaze, her own unwavering, of what was in that container, Mr. Moretti, and of every last person who knew about it. In the corner, the jazz trio played on, a slow, Feels, mournful tune that no one in the room could actually hear. Victor picked up the bourbon she'd poured. He didn't drink it. He just swirled the glass, watching the light catch in the amber liquid. Let's assume for a moment you're telling the truth, he said. Feels. Why bring it to me? Why not the feds? Why not the news? Because the bureau's already dirty, she said. The sentence landed in the electric air. And the press, she added. They don't have the context to understand what they're looking at. Not yet, Feels. But yes, Feels. Because it's my own organization. Because your name is on every document, she corrected. And because whoever is pulling the strings of your operation does not care what happens to you when it all goes public, Feels. They are perfectly happy to let you take the fall for all of it, legally and otherwise. Victor put the glass down. You're saying there's a conspiracy to set me up. I'm saying the trap is already built, she told him. Feels. The only question left is whether you find the man who built it before he decides to spring it. Matteo's hand was back inside his coat. This is the trap right here, he cut in. She's working for someone else. She's pushing their story, Feels. She isn't working for anyone, Victor said. You can't know that. I do know it, Victor said, his voice flat and final. Because if she was, she'd already be dead, Feels. Legal counsel should have been sent. His gaze bored into her. Is that not the way of things? A shadow of a smile, a thing of light and curve, played at the corner of Emily Carter's mouth. One might think, she breathed. Container 404, Feels. Victor pressed. The response did not come. Her eyes fell to her own hands, and for an instant the mask of composure cracked, exposing the terrible weight of what she had done. It was an anchor, colder and more immense than any fear. Children, she said. Feels. The word wasn't spoken. It was a vacuum that pulled all sound and air from the room. A strangled animal sound tore from Frank Caruso's throat, and he had to turn his face to the wall. Mateo's hand slipped from his lapel, and near the door's heels, two men shared a glance, the first flicker of unguarded soul seen between them since the sun had set. Heels. Victor was a statue, frozen in the amber light of the bar, unmoving. "The manifest," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut the dense quiet. "The numbers. From the dimensions, the logs, no fewer than 20, possibly more. And they were taken," Heels, she confirmed, "before an alarm was ever tripped. An extraction." Victor pushed himself up from the stool. He made a slow pilgrimage to the far end of the bar and turned from them, his palms pressed into the dark wood as if it were the only solid thing left. Heels. The jazz trio ended one funereal piece and began another, but the notes simply died in the thickened air. "Victor," Frank Caruso rasped, a sound like autumn leaves crushed underfoot. Victor didn't acknowledge him. "We can't be sure it's legitimate, Victor." Heels. The answer came back, flat and heavy. "It's real. It was not a gas. It was a new and terrible law of nature. It's real, Frank." He pivoted. His face had been reformed, but into something harder still. Heels. There was no mercy in Victor Moretti's eyes, only the aftershock of a man watching his world burn. A foundational truth of his life had been shattered and rebuilt as a nightmare, and it came through my port, on my ships, handled by my people. Heels. His eyes were fixed, pinning Evelyn Carter in their glare. "The infection is inside." "Yes," she agreed, "and you already know who the traitor is." "I have a theory," he shot back. "That is not a fact." "No," she allowed. Heels. "But it is the altar upon which the questioning must begin." He stalked back towards her, closing the same 18 inches of space, studying her features like a man deciphering a map of some damned and foreign land. "Who are you?" he commanded. Heels. "And don't say Evelyn Carter." That name was buried with a 58-year-old man from Peoria in 2019. "I checked the number 40 minutes ago." Heels. If his words landed, she showed no wound, a perfect stillness. "My name is Evelyn Blake," she said. It felt as if the air itself had stilled, waiting. "You know the name," she stated. It was not a question. Heels. You could see the tension drawn tight as a wire along Victor's jaw. "Yes," he clipped out. "Then you know why I am here. Evelyn Blake is ghost." "A file sealed for 20 years, Victor countered. "Almost," she answered, "but not completely." Heels. The blood had drained from Frank Caruso's face, leaving it the color of bone. "That's not possible," said. "Your intel," Evelyn cut in, "was the story you were fed." Her gaze never left Victor, leaving Frank to drown in the silence. Heels. "I was listed as dead because I had to vanish. Because when I was 17, I watched 3 of your men kill my mother. I was the only one who saw." Heels. Victor was a study in absolute control, a man turned to marble. "I ran," she went on. "I built a life from nothing. A new name, a new history, an entirely different person forged from grief. And for 2 decades, I lived inside that lie." Heels. "Telling myself that just surviving was a kind of victory." She let the words hang in the air. "Then last Tuesday, Container 404 appeared on a manifest I watched for other reasons. And I saw the entry. I knew what was inside." Heels. Her voice began to fray. The perfect facade showed a crack, revealing something broken and wild beneath. And I decided that just being alive wasn't enough anymore. The jazz music stopped. You couldn't tell if they'd heard, Heels, or if the sheer gravity in the room had finally crushed the sound itself. The silence that followed was absolute. Heels. Victor Moretti held Evelyn Blake in his gaze for a long, unblinking moment. "The men," he finally spoke, "the ones responsible for your mother's death. 2 are in the ground," she replied. "The 3rd is still a valued member of your organization." Heels. Victor's head turned with a slow, mechanical certainty, like a weapon locking onto a target, towards Frank Caruso. Frank was staring at the floorboards, as if they held the answers to a prayer. "Frank," Victor said. "Victor, I swear to God, the container." Heels. "I knew nothing about." "I'm not talking about the container," Victor's voice sliced through the pathetic plea. "I'm talking about a woman, Margaret Blake, 20 years ago, a warehouse on the South End." Frank's jaw worked, but no words came out. Heels. Evelyn watched him with the terrible patience of someone who has played one horrific memory over and over for 2 decades. "I was there," Frank finally choked out. "But it wasn't my call, Victor." Heels. "The order came from whose order?" Victor's voice was quiet and final. Heels. "It was." Frank's voice broke. His eyes fled, darting to the door, to the 2 silent figures standing guard. He looked anywhere but at Victor or Evelyn. "I can't say," he stammered. "Victor, if I give you his name, you won't believe it," Frank begged. Heels. "And his boss?" Victor, these are people so protected, so high up the ladder, that even breathing their names in this room, say his name, Victor commanded. Frank Caruso's lips pressed into a thin, white line. His hand shook. This man, feels. A 31-year soldier in their world, a man who had walked through wars, was coming apart at the seams. Daniel, he breathed. The entire room seemed to draw a single sharp breath. Daniel Cross, Frank said. He gave the order. 20 years ago. Heals. And the container last Tuesday, Victor, Daniel was behind that too. This whole sickness. The trafficking, the shipment, the setup. Daniel has been growing this cancer inside your world for 5 years at least. Maybe more. Heals. And he's been doing it with permission from someone higher up. Someone powerful enough to buy this much silence. Victor's head turned slowly, his gaze sweeping the darkened room before it locked onto the man half swallowed by shadows near the exit. Feels. Daniel Cross. For 11 years, Victor's most trusted man. He stood there now, one hand buried in his jacket, and the look on his face was not the look of an innocent man being framed. Feels. It was the expression of a man feeling the earth close over him. How long have you been there? Victor asked. Daniel Cross gave him only silence. Daniel, Victor said again, take your hand out of your jacket. Daniel Cross obeyed. Feels. But the hand that appeared was not empty. Evelyn Blake did not flinch. She did not even blink. She had lived this precise moment in her imagination 1,000 times before she ever walked into this bar. A pact with this exact ending had been made long ago. Feels. But Victor Moretti moved, stepping into the space between her and Daniel Cross, shielding her with his own body. It was an act no one expected. It seemed to surprise Victor himself, a decision made by flesh and bone before his mind could cast a vote. Feels. He stood with his back to Evelyn, his eyes fixed on Daniel, his own hands held open and away from his sides. No threat, no aggression, just a man standing between a gun and a woman he had no reason on earth to save. Put it down, Victor said. Victor, Feels. Daniel pleaded. You don't know what you're protecting. You have no idea who she is or who she works for. I know exactly who she is, Victor said, and I know what you did, and I know about the container. His voice was perfectly steady. It always was. Feels. This is the last time I'm going to tell you. Put the gun down. Daniel Cross stared at the pistol. His gaze shot around the room, 12 men, all of them watching, none of them moving. Because none of them knew, until that very moment, Feels, how far Daniel had truly fallen from grace. Feels. Even in their violent lives, some things were sacred, and the men in that room, whatever their sins, lived by a code. The cargo in Container 404 had spat on that code. This will burn everything, Daniel warned. Your whole world, Feels, if she walks out of here. It's already burned, Evelyn said from just behind Victor's shoulder. Daniel's eyes snapped to her. The proof I mentioned, she continued, it isn't in one place, Feels. Copies were sent to 3 different secure locations before I came here. If I don't check in by 0600 hours, it all goes public to people who will know exactly what to do with it. Daniel Cross lowered the gun, not out of mercy, Feels, but because the cold equations had changed. Even now, at the very end of his world, Daniel Cross was a man who understood numbers. Feels. He turned his gaze to her. Oh, 600 hours, the words left his lips again, each one a lead weight. Yes, that's a 4-hour window. I'm aware, she said, her voice like glass. The time is narrow. Her eyes met his, unblinking. Feels. I am aware of that, she repeated, but it is the only time we have been given. Victor Moretti studied the woman before him. This ghost who had spent 2 decades erasing every trace of her existence, Feels, only to reappear and unravel his 23-year legacy in the space of a single night. Something deep behind his gaze fractured, a look none of his men had ever seen. It wasn't regret. It was not an apology. It was something more ancient, Feels. A piece of him that had lain dormant, waiting for the one call that could summon it from the abyss. Your mother, he said, the name and invocation. Margaret Blake. Yes, Evelyn affirmed. I never sanctioned that order, he stated. I know, she replied. Feels. But the order was sanctioned in my name. Feels. Yes, she said it was. Feels. A slow, almost imperceptible nod from Victor. He reached for the bourbon she'd poured, the glass he'd left untouched, and drained it in one smooth, final motion. He set the empty tumbler back on the bar with the precision of a bomb maker. Proceed, he said. Feels, his voice a low hum. I want the full report. Every detail. Evelyn Blake, after 4 hours of granite stillness, finally drew a stool from under the bar and sat. And so, in the hushed back room of the Meridian, Feels, while Daniel Cross was held captive by the eyes of men who had been his brothers, as Frank Caruso stared at his own hands like foreign objects, And as a dozen other souls tried to piece their shattered world back together, Evelyn began to speak. Eels. She spoke for a long time, and Victor Moretti simply listened. For the first time in 23 years, he was receiving a pure intelligence stream, unvarnished, from a source that had grown inside his own walls. Eels. It was the most corrosive data he had ever been forced to process. 40 minutes bled away in a monologue delivered without a single stolen breath. Not because she was breathless. No, Eels. This was a soliloquy rehearsed in the echoing solitude of 1,000 anonymous hotel rooms, its chilling rhythm perfected over years of silence. She knew the sequence, the precise measure of truth to administer at every stage. Infraction, Eels. She had come to understand, was the only currency that never loses its value. And so Victor listened as he always listened, without moving, without a single flicker of reaction. Nothing she could read. He was a black hole, Eels, absorbing the architecture of a terrible new world. Eels. Vittorio remained motionless, elbow planted on the bar, his focus locked on her as the tide of information crashed over him. The other men in his orbit were phantoms, frozen in a state of suspended reality. No one was excused. Eels. No one would have dared to move. Even Daniel Cross, a silhouette pinned against the far wall by his men Matteo and Garrett, was held in the trance. He was not a threat. The woman, Evelyn, had neutralized him long before she ever walked in. Eels. Those dossiers she'd sent were not a warning. She was never so crude. Instead, she unspooled the truth, piece by damning piece. It started with a single anomaly, a shipping container, flagged 8 months prior for a falsified manifest. Eels. Then came the wire transfers, disguised as routine logistical fees, all encoded with the correct ciphers and industry language. Eels. There was nothing there to flag for anyone who wasn't already looking for a ghost. Next, she laid out the call logs, acquired from a source she pointedly left unnamed, connecting a disposable phone to a prepaid number. Eels. That number traced back to a shell corporation which, through 4 layers of corporate deceit, pointed to a man named Gerald Stokes. Vittorio's face remained a mask of stone when he heard the name, but his body betrayed him. His right hand, Eels, which lay flat on the bar, slowly clenched into a fist. "Does that name mean anything to you?" she asked. "I know the name," he said. "Then you know he is not." "I know exactly what he is," Vittorio cut her off. Eels. He is a sitting United States Senator from the state of Illinois. Eels. He has held that position for 16 years. His official title is chairman of the Subcommittee on Interstate Commerce and Transportation. A heavy silence descended, thick enough to choke on. He was a guest at my daughter's wedding. Eels. The pressure in the room changed, becoming a physical thing with a sharp edge. A small, strangled sound escaped Frank Caruso's throat. "He attended your daughter's wedding," Evelyn repeated, her voice perfectly flat, "and for no less than 2 years, Eels, has been using your shipping network to move children across state lines." "Using my network?" Vittorio challenged. "Or using my name?" "Both," she answered. "But you didn't know." Vittorio stared at her, his eyes sharp enough to slice glass. Eels. "How sure are you of that?" 100%, she said. "Because if you knew, you and I would not be having this conversation." It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement of fact, and he received it as such. Eels. "Show me the logs," he commanded. She produced a folded envelope from her jacket, placing it on the bar. Vittorio took it. He opened it. His face was a closed vault as he read, turning each page with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. Eels, his eyes scanning back twice over certain lines. The room had gone utterly still. The jazz trio had vanished hours ago, leaving behind no melody to conceal the sound of a world breaking apart. Vittorio slid the documents back into the envelope. Eels. "The burner phone," he started, "the one that links back to Stokes' shell." "Yes. The last call it made was 4 days ago." "Correct. To Daniel Cross." From across the room, Daniel's voice shattered the silence. "Vittorio, don't." Eels. He did not raise his voice. His eyes were locked on Daniel, but he spoke to the polished wood of the bar. "Do not speak, Daniel. I need about 60 seconds to come to a decision, and if you say another word," Eels, "I will make the one from which neither of us can ever come back." Daniel Cross said nothing. 60 seconds passed. Evelyn felt herself counting each one. Then Vittorio lifted his head, his gaze finding Daniel's across the room. 4 days ago, Eels. "I can explain," Daniel begged. "For 2 years you have been trafficking children through my port," Vittorio said, each word a hammer striking steel. "My people, my papers, my name. And 4 days ago, Eels, you were still speaking with the man at the center of it all." Eels. "It's not that simple." "The money?" Vittorio asked. Daniel's eyes did the slow, heavy blink of a man trapped. What? How much did he pay you? The silence that answered was a confession written in the air. Eels. Every man in the room knew that whatever number Daniel Cross spoke now would be the wrong one. 2 million, Daniel finally whispered. Vittorio nodded. It was not a nod of comprehension. It was the gesture of a man carving a fact into stone, Eels, where it would remain for eternity. Matteo, Vittorio said. Sir, take him to the back room, Vittorio. Daniel took one step forward, but Garrett's hand shot out like a viper, clamping onto his arm and stopping him cold. He looked at Vittorio, Eels, his face a canvas of pure raw desperation. Eels. Vittorio, you don't understand what this is. Stokes isn't one person. He's a ghost in a machine, judges, DAs, City Hall. He is buried so deep under layers of protection you will never find him. If you go after him with what she has. Eels. He jerked his head toward Evelyn. They will bury you. They will bury her. They will burn everything you've ever built to the ground. That is a distinct possibility, Vittorio conceded. Daniel could only stare. Eels, the last of his frantic hopes turning to ash. Take him to the back, Vittorio said again. This time, Matteo and Garrett moved, and Daniel Cross, the man who was Vittorio Moretti's right hand for 11 years, Eels, while using the last two of them to betray everything that hand had ever built, was gone. Eels. Silence returned. Then Frank Caruso spoke. Vittorio, I have to say something. Go on. 20 years ago, and Frank's voice was a tremor, but the words were clear. The warehouse. Margaret Blake. He stopped. Eels. As if measuring how much poison the room could hold. Daniel started it, but I was there. I did nothing, and I have lived with that. He stopped again. Evelyn watched him, her expression a perfect blank. I have lived with that for 20 years, Frank finished. Eels. I am not asking for anything from either of you. I am just stating a fact. How old was I? Frank looked her right in the eye. 17. And my mother? 41, Frank answered, his voice a whisper. Eels. Reciting a number he had clearly tried to forget. Eels. Did she say anything? Evelyn asked. At the end? The question seemed to land like a physical blow on Frank. She said your name, he answered. She said it twice. Evelyn's eyes fell to the bar. There was no tear. Eels. That part of her had been burned away years ago in desolate rooms, where she'd learned that grief is not a storm you survive, but a permanent climate you learn to breathe in, and tonight she was breathing. She had to be. Acknowledged, she said. I'm sorry. Eels. Frank whispered. I know. I said acknowledged, Frank, she replied, her voice devoid of tone. Not forgiven, not forgotten, acknowledged. The information is now processed. Vittorio had watched it all, his face revealing nothing. Eels. His gaze fell upon Evelyn. What is it you require? Her answer was immediate, without a flicker of hesitation. Access to your real ledgers, the ones you keep for yourself. Not the sanitized books Daniel was allowed to touch. Eels. I have to trace every single contact point Stokes burrowed into your organization. Every driver, every foreman, every man on the piers. I need the full anatomy of the cancer. And after? After, we take this to someone who can burn him with it. Eels, she replied. Not the Bureau. They're poisoned, like I said. But I have a man, a federal prosecutor named Hartman. He spent 3 years trying to build a case against Stokes with only scraps. My information, Eels, married to yours. You want me to partner with a federal prosecutor? Vittorio's voice was incredulous. Eels. I need you to live through what's coming, she countered, her voice dropping low. And Hartman is the only way you survive. His words were gravel, a grinding of stone on stone. You want me to lay open 23 years of my life's work for him to see, Eels, and pray he only carves out the parts that will put Stokes in a cage. Yes, she breathed out. That is the definition of madness. The alternative, she said, her words slicing the air, is Stokes burying you before you can bury him, Eels. He's aware the container was hit. He's aware the records are gone. Soon he will know something happened to Daniel, and when he follows that trail back, your name will be the first body he throws to whatever agency comes knocking, Eels. Vittorio's eyes drifted to the empty glass he was holding. He'll trade me, Vittorio said, the truth of it a weight of cold lead in his throat. Eels. It wasn't a question. It was an epitaph for a life that had just vanished. He will serve you up to the FBI on a silver platter before the week is over, she confirmed. By that point, your power to negotiate will be ash. But right now, you have the files. Eels. You have Daniel, and you have me. It's enough to go to Hartman and write your own ending, instead of letting Stokes script your destruction. A heavy, profound silence descended, filling the room. From the edge of the light, Eels, Frank Caruso's voice materialized. She's not wrong, Vittorio. I know how right she is, Vittorio shot back, his voice wound tight with pressure. That's the part that makes me sick. He shoved himself from the bar, heels, turning his back on them to face the pure monolithic black of the window, his hands clasped behind him as if already in chains. Evelyn watched the rigid line of his shoulders, heels. She had long ago mastered the science of reading men in their silence, in the small, unwilled confessions of the body when it believes no one is watching. The tension in Vittorio's posture was a quiet scream of war, a war being waged solely inside him, heels. My father built this empire, he started, his voice aimed at his own reflection, at the glittering city spread out below, from dust. 40 years. He ran it for 20. I've run it for 23. We took our losses. We made choices that, heels. The words died there, the sin left unconfessed. Some I regret. Others I do again, but there was always a line, a sacred one. Children, heels. His voice didn't crack. Men like Vittorio Moretti do not permit their armor to split in front of others. But the very character of it changed. A shift in pitch, like a string pulled to its breaking point. Heels. There was always a goddamn line. I know, Evelyn said, her voice soft. Stokes pissed all over my line, Vittorio spat, every syllable dripping with a cold and focused rage. He used the sum total of my life's work to cross the one boundary I would never, heels, not in 1,000 years go near. I know. Vittorio turned from the window, his face a mask of hard finality. All right, he bit out. What's the clock? 6 a.m. is the dead man's switch. The files go public then, no matter what, she said, heels. I'd rather have Hartman on our side before that happens. Vittorio's eyes cut to Frank. You have his personal number. A sliver of confusion showed on Frank's face. Hartman? Why in God's name would I have? Because 3 years ago, heels, you tried to cut your own deal with him. I told you to back off, and you did. But you kept the number, Vittorio said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I know how you think, Frank. 40 years, you kept it. Heels. As if moved by an external force, Frank's hand slid into his pocket and produced his phone. Heels. Find it, Vittorio ordered. While Frank's thumbs worked the screen, Evelyn saw Vittorio change. He was a ghost in his own house, a swift current moving between his men, heels, murmuring low commands she couldn't catch, a total tactical reset that would take any other crew days to pull off, done in heartbeats. Victor Moretti was a predator, and predators do not grant themselves the indulgence of being slow. In his world, heels, slowness was another word for a grave. Her own thoughts rewound. A memory broke the surface, a frozen warehouse on Chicago's South Side 2 decades gone, heels. A 17-year-old girl running down a dark alley with nothing but what she was wearing and one faded photograph. Then the long, long years of burying that girl under layers of fake names, of qualifications earned in the dead of night, heels. The patient assembly of a ghost who could walk into this room and set this endgame in motion, heels. The job, a nothing analyst position at a shipping firm, was the key to the entire kingdom, the databases that mapped the flow of global trade. So many years of watching, of waiting, heels, of honing her will for this single moment when all the pieces would finally fall into place. In not one projection, in not one single simulation, had she ever planned for Victor Moretti taking a bullet for her, heels. That one human act was a variable her math had never included, and she still hadn't reconciled its meaning. Got it, Frank said, holding out the phone. Victor came back to the bar. He took the phone, heels, his eyes burning into the numbers on the screen before they rose to meet Evelyn's. You said Hartman's clean. He's as clean as a man can be who wades through a sewer for a living, she shot back. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement, heels. It's the most honest one I can give you, heels. A ghost of a smile touched Victor's lips but died before it was born. Empty the room, he ordered, his voice ringing in the sudden quiet, his eyes locked on Evelyn. Frank started to protest. Cita, Matteo, and Daniel, put that fire out. The rest of you, heels, disappear. The room bled out, the men leaving with the quiet, practiced efficiency of soldiers used to sudden storms. The absence they left behind made the space feel immense, a cathedral of shadow and glass, heels. Victor set Frank's phone down on the polished wood. Before I make this call, he said softly, there's one more thing I need. May I? He leaned closer. The 2 decades you spent on this, he said. The files, the network, heels, the way you broke into those systems. It all had a price. It would cost a fortune, more than one. He held her gaze, silently commanding her not to look away. Heels. Who funded you, Evelyn? She had been waiting for the question. This wasn't curiosity. It was a final necessary piece of his survival equation. Hartman, she said without blinking. Victor's face was unreadable, carved from granite. Heels. He's been backing my entire operation for the last 3 years, she added. Completely off the books, with his own money, mostly. He couldn't get to Stokes through official channels. Stokes has too many friends at the DOJ. Feels. So he found me, or I found him. The story changes depending on who's telling it, and we've been building the case, brick by painful brick. Which means Hartman has everything you've already shown me, Victor deduced. Feels. The logic clicking into place like the chambering of a round. He has what I've allowed him to have. Feels. Which is most of it, she admitted. But he doesn't have you. He doesn't have Danny Echevarria. He doesn't have the internal manifests that prove Stokes was using your whole network, your roots. Without them, his case has holes. It's strong, Feels, but not unbreakable. With them, she let the sentence hang between them, heavy with consequence. With them he can bury him, Victor finished. With them he can burn all of them to the ground, she corrected. Stokes and his whole network of shadows, Feels. Stokes is just the man at the gate for everyone else who's been feeding on your business. The entire machine. Victor stared down at the phone. You didn't just come here tonight to warn me, he stated, the words measured and cold. That's right, Feels, she confirmed. You came here to flip me. I came here to give you a choice. Feels. The choice, she said, her voice barely a whisper, between being the piece sacrificed by a machine that used you, or being the man who sets the whole board on fire. Victor reached out, his fingers closing around the phone. Is Hartman expecting this call? Feels. He knows it's a possibility. And his orders? Her eyes met his. He said if Victor Moretti ever calls this number, I was to answer before the second ring. Victor Moretti's thumb pressed the screen. A single sharp ring cut through the silence. Feels. Then a voice, awake, sharp, the voice of a man who had waited years for a call he never thought would come. This is Hartman. Victor looked at Evelyn, and in that one look, a contract was signed. It wasn't trust. It wasn't friendship. Feels. It was the naked recognition of two people who had just stepped off a cliff together, into an abyss from which neither would ever be able to climb back. Feels. This is Victor Moretti, the voice said. Less a name than a declaration. I believe you were looking for me. A moment of dead air hung on the line, thick with consequence. Mr. Moretti, Hartman's voice finally returned. Feels. I've been looking for you for 3 years. Well, Victor stated, you found me. He lifted the bourbon glass, still empty, and turned it once between his fingers, a world spinning in his palm. We need to talk about Gerald Stokes tonight. Feels. Hartman's answer was instant. 1 hour. Victor ended the call. The phone was set down on the polished bar. The empty glass was placed beside it. But the night was only just beginning. Out in the city's veins, Stokes was making his own moves. Feels. While in a room without windows, Daniel Cross was a bomb of secrets counting down, and in 3 separate hidden places the data waited for the 6 a.m. sun to set their world on fire. Feels. A sunrise that none of them could afford to see. And yet, in the 6 hours since Evelyn Blake had walked through his door, something new had materialized in the room. It was a tiny thing, almost nothing. A fragile promise that guaranteed nothing at all. Feels. But it was there. Victor Moretti watched the woman who had spent 2 decades turning herself into a ghost, all for the chance to walk in Leanne's den and hand King the agonizing truth. His voice was a near whisper. She would have been proud of you, Feels. Your mother Evelyn's eyes flashed, sharp as broken glass. Don't. I know, he said, his tone softening. I know, and he did. There are some wounds that words can never touch, a lesson etched into both of them by the cruelest of teachers, Feels. So instead of speaking again, Victor Moretti reached under the bar, took out a second clean glass, poured 2 fingers of bourbon into each, and slid one across the dark wood toward her, and this time her hand moved to take it. Feels. There was no toast raised. There were no victories here to claim. They sat in the humming silence of the club, 2 ghosts holding vigil at their own wake, the weight of the coming hour pressing down, making the very air thick and hard to breathe. Feels. They were waiting for a federal prosecutor to arrive and take apart the world they knew. In a room down the hall, the entire future Daniel Cross had built for himself was collapsing, the escape hatch he'd always counted on having vanished an hour ago. Feels. And 14 blocks north, in a glass tower that clawed at the sky, Gerald Stokes stared at his phone, at one last text from a number that would never reply again. Feels, and felt a poison he hadn't tasted in 16 years of absolute power begin to seep back into his blood. Feels. Anxiety is never on time. Hartman arrived in 53 minutes, not the full hour, a vulgar interruption of their silent ceremony. Evelyn heard the knock first, one solid rap that immediately shattered into a nervous, stuttering rhythm. Feels. It was the sound of a man trying to fake composure and failing miserably. A nearly invisible nod traveled from Victor to the man guarding the entrance. James Hartman stepped into the Meridian. Heels. He carried a leather briefcase scarred with the marks of old battles, and his face was a portrait drawn in caffeine and barely contained dread. He was younger than his legend suggested. Mid-40s, maybe, and rail-thin. Heels. The wire-rimmed glasses and gray suit had once spoken of money, but now they only screamed exhaustion. He stopped, his eyes taking in the scene, the carefully arranged emptiness, the silent stage. Heels, the men stationed around the room like figures of quiet violence. He let none of it show on his face. Heels. Evelyn noted the control with the cold admiration of one master observing another. His eyes found hers before anyone else's. "You made it," he breathed, his voice a thin wire of sound. "I made it," she confirmed. Then his gaze shifted to Victor Moretti. Heels. Whatever shield Hartman had brought with him, whatever lines he had rehearsed for this meeting, all of it evaporated in the sheer gravity of the man sitting before him. For 3 long heartbeats, the air in the room felt like it had turned to glass. Heels. "Finally, Mr. Moretti, counselor." Victor's voice was the sound of grinding metal. "One thing has to be clear before this goes any further," Hartman said, placing his briefcase on the table like a shield wall. Heels. "Any deal we make in here has to survive in the light of day. I won't broker anything I can't defend to my supervisor at 7 a.m. Heels. "Your supervisor doesn't know you're here," Victor stated. It wasn't a question, it was an observation. Hartman didn't bother to deny it. "My supervisor gets a full report at sunrise," he shot back. "But the bones of this deal get put together here, by us." Heels. "You have to accept that." "I accept that," Victor said. "Sit." Hartman sat. Victor took the chair opposite him. Evelyn remained at the bar, a silent figure posted at the very edge of earshot. Heels. The designated historian for the tragedy she herself had set in motion 3 years ago. She would not rush its ending. "Daniel Cross is in the back," Victor announced, his voice devoid of emotion. A faint tremor flickered deep behind Hartman's eyes. Heels. "Is he talking?" "He is assessing the market value of his own life." Heels. "Right now," Victor elaborated, "he's weighing whether telling you everything he knows about Stokes is a better option than what Stokes will do to him for the betrayal. He's not sure yet." "I can help him with the math," Hartman offered. "I'm sure you can." Heels. Victor leaned forward, and the room seemed to shrink, collapsing into the space between the two men. "But before you talk to Daniel, you and I are going to establish what I'm willing to give you, and what I'm not." Heels. Hartman took a yellow legal pad and a pen from his case. The click of the pen echoed in the silence. It sounded like the starting gun for a race to hell. "Go on." "I'll give you Stokes," Victor began. "Tied with a bow. The shell companies," Heels. "The wire transfer records, the shipping manifests. I will give you every single man on my payroll he ever turned. Every driver, every dock foreman, every compromised city official." Heels. It was a sacrifice of blood laid out on the table between them, and then without a single beat of hesitation came the price. "My organization," Victor said, his voice dropping, each word a heavy stone being laid for a foundation. Heels. "What I built, you don't touch." This was not a condition of a deal. It was a declaration of sovereignty. This wasn't a business to him. It was the architecture of his life. As Hartman's mind raced to process the impossible demand, Victor pressed on. Heels. "I'm not done." He then began to methodically tear Hartman's case apart, painting it as a fragile collection of whispers and shadows. Heels. A circumstantial ghost story that Stokes's lawyers would laugh out of court in less than an hour. A direct assault on the very core of Hartman's professional soul. Heels. "Total immunity." Hartman breathed the words like a heresy. For a 23-year career, Victor instantly recast the entire moment, lifting it from the world of law into the realm of fate. He laid out a new reality. Heels. A choice between two futures that could not coexist. "You can have Stokes with nothing, or you can have him with the weapons I give you, on the terms I will accept." He made it a question of his own will, his own endurance. He mentioned his age, 61. Heels. Not as a weakness, but as proof of his permanence against the fleeting nature of a career like Hartman's. He ended by dismissing the very idea of a negotiation, of haggling over the price for a man he knew, and they both knew, was a ghost without his help. Heels. Hartman's desperate gaze shot to Evelyn, searching for some kind of sign. Heels. She was a monument of stillness, a silent queen surveying the endgame. Her only job was to unlock this room, not to sanctify the deals made inside it. Hartman, finding no help there, tried to claw back a piece of the board. Heels. He countered with partial immunity, trying to draw lines in the sand around specific crimes, specific years. An amnesty with fences. Victor's reply was the soft, lethal sound of a knife being drawn from its sheath. Define specific, Eels. So Hartman laid out his terms. The trafficking, Container 404, the entire Stokes network. All of it wiped from the books in exchange for his complete cooperation. But Victor's other life, that long and violent history, Eels, would remain a debt to be collected another day. Eels. Victor heard the hidden threat beneath the words. You're holding a weapon for later. Hartman tried to mask the move with a performance of good faith, one last attempt to create trust in the poisoned air between them, Eels. He admitted that a blanket amnesty for a career like Victor's, stretching back to 1991, was impossible, a political truth they both understood. His offer, he claimed, was a firewall around the Stokes investigation, Eels, a documented record of assistance, and his personal word he would argue for mercy later. Just then, Frank Caruso stepped back into the room. A silent, almost imperceptible nod passed between him and Victor, the prearranged signal. The plan was holding. Eels. Victor shifted his attack. Daniel's testimony alone will make the case impossible to defend. With yours, Hartman countered, and your evidence, it makes it a certainty. Eels. The negotiation was over. Victor was now giving orders. This is how it's going to happen. He told Hartman to go get Daniel's statement while he went to retrieve the real leverage. Something better than phone records. Eels. The prosecutor's pen froze above the page. Better in what way? Victor's eyes found Evelyn again, a silent look passing between them. He was confirming the story they had built. She affirmed the first flagged shipment was 26 months ago. Eels. There's a safe, Victor told Hartman, its location a secret he would hold until the very end. Inside it, he explained, were ledgers. 11 years of them, every name, every secret loyalty his entire world had ever been built on. Eels. He called it insurance at first, before revealing the darker tenet of his power. In this world, Victor said, his voice like a cold draft, you find what people are afraid of. You collect it, because people who are afraid don't move. Eels. He let that sink into the silence of the room. Stokes is in these books, going back much further than 26 months. The pen slipped through Hartman's fingers. How much further? Hartman breathed, the question hanging heavy with what it implied. Eels. Victor answered, to rewrite the entire story. A chilling, invasive cold seeped into Evelyn's bones. Her eyes locked on Victor, her voice thin, brittle. How far? His gaze was measured, heavy. Eels. The look of a man deciding if a soul could bear the weight of a truth. It didn't start with the containers, Victor said, his voice low. Eels. The sin began small, wrapped in the ordinary. Waivers for zoning, permits for liquor. The kind of everyday corruption that hides a rot deep inside. The earliest contract I can trace is from 14 years ago. Eels. The words landed in the room with the thud of dirt on a coffin. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. And what was the contract for? A warehouse, Victor said. Southside, Orion, 14 years. That was 2 years before her mother was killed. Eels. The very air in the room felt like it could shatter. Stokes, Victor explained, was a ghost. Ownership of the property was buried under 4 different shell corporations. Victor's people had just been renting storage. Eels, completely unaware of who their landlord truly was. Eels. All his business had been done through a proxy. For years, Stokes himself never came out of the shadows. But the ledger, Victor promised, traced the money straight to the man himself. He was connected to that building, Evelyn said, Eels, the words feeling like acid on her tongue. Yes, before my mother died, yes. The silence that followed was a chasm. Neither man spoke, neither dared to step into the violent sacred space of her realization. A whole life's story was cracking apart. Eels. You didn't know, she finally said. It wasn't a question. It was a raw plea for one thing to remain true. I didn't know, Victor confirmed, his voice thick with the understanding that his own ignorance changed nothing. But she had to hear him say it, Eels, right now, before those ledgers told the world for him. Eels. That truth was a ticking bomb, set to go off in the town square the moment Hartman made his move on Stokes. But Victor would not let Evelyn feel that explosion in the cold, clinical text of a legal document. Eels. A hard line drew itself across Evelyn's mouth, the physical trace of a scream she swallowed. 14 years, 2 years before they murdered her mother. Stokes was already there, a part of that world, tied to that place, those people, Eels, and the chain of crimes her mother must have found. The very foundation of her grief started to break, reforming into something else, something sharper. My mother, she whispered, her voice a hollow thing. It was never random. No, Eels. Victor's voice was a quiet finality in the room. I don't believe it was. She was hunting Stokes, and Victor's silence was his admission. Hartman, ever the lawyer, saw the new angle on the tragedy. Heels. If her mother was looking into Stokes 14 years ago, then the entire equation of this fight had just changed. Heels. And just like that, the floor fell away. Her mother's death was no longer some isolated island of chance horror. It was now a peninsula, possibly attached to the same criminal enterprise we're taking down tonight. The crime grew, Heels, spreading from human trafficking into a federal murder case. A murder that now had threads reaching all the way to a sitting United States senator. It was a psychic shockwave, Heels, and Evelyn's body reacted before her mind could. She pushed away from the stool, a physical rejection of a truth too massive to comprehend. She turned from them, a small frantic movement to find her own air to breathe. Her life's work, Heels, a fortress of logic built over 20 years, had a plan for everything except this. The cornerstone of her entire being was one simple, brutal fact. Her mother's death was random, a case of wrong place, wrong time. Heels. This new reality, that her mother was hunting this same monster, walking this exact same road, was too much, an earthquake too violent to survive in one piece. How sure are you? The question was for the wall. She couldn't bring herself to look at them. Heels. The ledger is the ledger, Victor replied, stating a fact, not offering comfort. When she finally turned back to them, the fragility was gone, sealed away behind a mask of cold iron. You could see the gears of her mind click into place. Heels. She was compartmentalizing. She took the searing, white-hot pain of this new knowledge, shoved it into a mental box, and slammed the lid shut. Grief could wait, later, after the mission was complete. Get Daniel, she ordered Victor. Heels, her voice now forged from steel. Get him in here now. Heels. Victor gives a nod, and Frank disappears from the room. The only sound is the frantic scratching of Hartman's pen against paper, the noise of a man who knows this interview will define the rest of his career. Then Daniel Cross is brought in, Heels, with Mateo at his side. The cool composure he wore an hour ago has crumbled into something that looks very much like fear. Fear is a good thing. It's the sound of a man's defenses beginning to crack. His eyes find Hartman. You're James Hartman, he says. Heels, the words barely a whisper. Assistant U.S. Attorney, Hartman answers, without looking up from his notes. Sit down, Mr. Cross. Daniel's eyes dart to Victor, terror and disbelief warring for control of his face. You really did it. Sit down, Daniel. Heels. Victor says again, his tone leaving no room for argument. A chair scrapes the floor, and Hartman begins the slow, methodical work of taking a man's life apart. Heels. I have documentation that links you directly to the trafficking network of Gerald Stokes. He lays the files out like a hand of damning tarot cards, burner phones, a shell company, falsified manifests for 3 separate shipments, Heels, and an informant who puts him at the center of it all for the last 24 months. Daniel's focus drifts, then sharpens on Evelyn. There's a strange light in his eyes. It's more than just seeing her, Heels. It's a connection being made in the ruins of his life. Who are you, he demands. He isn't just asking a woman her name. He's challenging the person who engineered his downfall. It doesn't matter who I am, she replies, her voice flat. Heels, denying him the one piece of information his ego desperately needs to process his own destruction. It matters to me, he insists, his wounded pride on full display, the absolute insult of being ruined by a ghost who just wiped out 2 years of his work. Heels. He freezes. Heels. A wave of nauseating understanding washes over him. Daniel wasn't just an analyst who flew too close to the sun. Stokes, he says, and the name itself seems to suck the warmth out of the room. Stokes knows about you. The air goes electric. Heels. The whole game has just changed. Victor's voice is sharp, a blade. What did you just say? Daniel, 4 days ago. Stokes called him, not about shipping containers, but about internal inquiries into his companies, flagged by a source on the inside. Heels. Stokes was hunting for the person digging into his world. Daniel claimed he knew nothing, but he, a flicker of panic in his eyes, he said he would find out who it was. A muscle jumps in Evelyn's jaw. When was this call? 4 days. An eternity. Heels. 4 days, she repeats, the words like ash in her mouth, which means he's had 4 days to follow that search back to my firm. Heels. It's possible, Daniel offers a hollow technical observation. Not possible, she snaps back, her mind already 3 moves down the board. If he has an IT guy in there, he gets a name in 48 hours, tops. Her gaze cuts to Hartman. Heels. A silent message about how fast the danger was closing in. He knows who I am. Hartman says the next terrible thought out loud. Then he knows you're here. Evelyn lays out the new battlefield. He has my professional identity. Maybe not a name, Beals, but the firm. He knows where I work, and that means... Her thought is shattered by the vibration of a phone on the table. Unknown number. For a single heartbeat, she recoils. Then her resolve hardens like steel. She answers it. Beals. A voice on the line speaks her name, Ms. Blake. Her body goes rigid with the cold shock of genuine terror. It is the voice of Gerald Stokes, a man who has controlled his universe for decades. It is smooth, unrushed. Beals. The voice of a predator that has never had to raise its voice. Beals. Senator, she replies, the title a reflex from a life she no longer lived. In that single moment, the entire room stops breathing, a herd of deer frozen by the scent of the lion. Victor moves across the room in 4 silent, deliberate strides. Beals. Planting himself beside her, a living shield. She hits the speakerphone button without being asked. His voice begins its attack with a compliment. I wanted to commend you. He mentions her 2 decades of work, Beals, then twists the blade by bringing up her mother. A precise psychological strike. She was a very determined woman. Evelyn answers his assault with pure silence. I hear you have quite the party there tonight, Stokes says, broadcasting his omniscience. Beals. I imagine Mr. Moretti is with you, and perhaps Mr. Hartman as well, if I am not mistaken. A perfectly timed pause. Am I mistaken, James? Hartman's face is carved from stone. You're not, he confirms. Good, the voice says. Beals. Then let us do away with the pretense. The voice lays its steel jaws bare. What you have, these papers, the accounts, it is a masterwork, truly. It is also in this moment nothing more than dust. Hartman's voice is a frayed wire. How? Beals. And so Stokes reveals the hand that will burn their world to the ground. 2 hours prior, a federal judge, Stokes he's shared drinks with for 21 years, put his signature to an order. Beals. An order that places the Calumet shipping terminal under official national security review. With that single stroke of ink, 36 months of transit records are now classified. Every manifest, every ledger entry, Beals, every last dollar is now entombed in a federal crypt that not even God, let alone Hartman, can open. Beals. The color vanishes from Hartman's face, a painterly stroke of absolute ruin. The documents Evelyn bled for, Stokes continues, his voice caressing each syllable like a lover, they were born almost entirely from that terminal's data. Beals. Which means her life's work is now classified state property, or it was acquired by means that make it poison in any courtroom. He lets the silence suffocate the room. Beals. The artistry was breathtaking, but you brought a scalpel to a war I've been waging with artillery for half a year. A dead final quiet descends, and then Victor speaks, his voice a shard of glass in the crushing stillness. You've erred, Gerald. Beals. To use his first name is an immediate violent reclamation of the stage. Have I? Stokes breathes. Beals. The ledger, Victor says. You believe you know where it rests. You are mistaken. Here is the counterstroke. The safe Stokes had watched for 18 agonizing months, the very heart of his entire intelligence operation, Beals, has been a hollow shell for the last 8. Because I moved it all. Victor's voice is low, cold as the grave. The very same week you came to my daughter's wedding and placed your hand in mine. The words are sculpted to open the deepest possible wound. Beals. Another pause stretches across the line, but this one has a different quality. It is the sound of a universe cracking. You knew, Stokes says. It is not a question. I suspected, Victor clarifies. Not about the children, but I knew you were a sickness, Beals, and I knew that eventually you would come to cleanse your sins. Beals. I simply ensured I was not the sin you thought you were cleansing. Where is it? Stokes demands, his voice stripped bare, a sudden nerve exposed to the air. The ledger, Victor says, delivering the killing blow, Beals, is in a place that has never once breathed the same air as the Calumet terminal. The national security order is now a ghost, an expensive piece of theater. Which means Hartman will have it in his hands by 8 in the morning, Beals, with a chain of custody as pure as driven snow. The line is utterly silent. You're bluffing, Stokes finally manages, a rasp of disbelief. Gerald, Victor replies, his tone almost surgical now. In the 40 years we have known one another, Beals, have I ever once bluffed? A final silence. This one feels different. It is the sound of a god staring at his own hands and realizing they are made of clay. Beals. This isn't over, Stokes insists, a phantom of command echoing through the speaker. It is, Evelyn answers, and her voice is not victorious, but hollowed out. Beals. The sound a field makes after the war has passed over it, a profound weariness that has scoured her clean. It was over the moment I walked in here. You simply hadn't been told. The line clicks, a sound as final as a chambered round. A thick Beals. Unbreathable silence consumes the room. It is Hartman who shatters it, his voice a hammer of cold fact. That order is real. Their sword, the evidence, has been broken. It is a complication, Victor corrects him, reshaping their reality with his words, heals, an act of sheer will meant to keep the battle alive. Not a conclusion. There is a difference. Heals. His gaze finds Evelyn. The ledger. Hartman gets it tonight. Her reply is immediate, stripped of all artifice. How long? 90 minutes, he answers. Then we move in 90 minutes. The contract is sealed in the space between them. Heals. But it is Daniel Cross who rips the delicate fabric of control, his professional facade crumbling to reveal the terrified soul beneath. He won't use the law, he says, his voice a thin tremor. He will come for us. All of us. Heals. Victor's reply is forged in winter. Let him. Daniel's voice shrinks to a whisper. Victor, a child's appeal lost in a slaughterhouse. In Victor's eyes there is no mercy, no anger, only the flat. Heals. Cold assessment of a craftsman deciding if a tool is now broken. Whatever bond they once shared is now ash, leaving only the brutal calculus of this one night. Heals. You have one act of consequence left. Victor's words are a clinical diagnosis, a final transaction. You know Stokes' entire world. Put it on a piece of paper. This is not an offer of salvation. Heals. It is an offer of function, a last chance to extract something pure from a contaminated source. You do this for us, and you give Hartman a sword. Daniel's eyes dart between the sterile white of the legal pad and the promise of the shadowed doorway. Feels, his mind caught in the brutal arithmetic of survival. And if I do, he whispers, what happens to me? You might see the sunrise, Victor states, his voice devoid of all warmth. It's more than you have earned, and more than you'll get if he finds you. Feels. Right in the ringing silence that follows, Daniel Cross reaches for the pen. Feels. Hartman pulls his chair in, carving out a small circle of purpose in the suffocating quiet. An impossible scene materializes in the low light. The federal prosecutor and the mafioso, their heads bent together over the birth of a confession, feels, tracing the skeletal structure of a 16-year crime drawn from the fear of a violent grave. Evelyn watches them for a beat. Then she turns, creating a deliberate island of isolation for herself at an empty table. Her phone casts a cold, feels, blue light onto her features as she composes 3 short, encrypted messages, digital missives to 3 separate phantoms, each a guardian of her life's archives. To anyone else, the text would look like meaningless code. Feels. Once sent, she places the phone down. She allows herself exactly 1 minute, a controlled 60-second descent into the wreckage of the last 5 hours. The images flash behind her eyelids. The climax of a 20-year hunt. Feels. Daniel's earth-shattering truth about her mother, the confrontation with Stokes, and the brutal, unexpected intervention from Victor Moretti. 60 seconds. And then she cuts the wire to the past. She is a weapon once more. Feels. She picks up her phone to contact the vital nerve of her operation, the source inside the shipping consultancy who gave her the key, the one who knows nothing of the night's bloody turn. Feels. The phone rings 4 times, each tone a heavy weight on her composure, before it falls into the dead air of voicemail. A cold fire of dread ignites deep in her gut. She tries again. The result is the same. In one seamless motion, feels, she is on her feet and moving toward Victor, who stands watching the interrogation. She puts a hand on his arm. When he turns, his eyes confirm he has already read the catastrophe in her expression. What? He says. A statement, not a question. My contact, feels. She says, her voice a low current of alarm. The asset inside, she's gone dark. Victor's entire presence shifts, the very air around him growing thin and sharp. Last contact 6 hours ago, she replies, before I came. Stokes, feels. Victor speaks the name like a curse. He had 4 days to trace the search, she thinks aloud. If he found the databases, he found her. Feels. If he found her, the thought dies in her throat, strangled by what it implies. Victor speaks a single name into the quiet. Frank. A man detaches himself from the deep shadows of the room. I need a tactical team at an address. Victor commands. Feels. His voice soft but unbreakable. Now. Evelyn recites the location, her voice a marvel of control even as a tremor begins in her hands. Frank is already moving, his own voice a low murmur into his comms. Across the room, feels. The pen scratches frantically against paper. The air is thick with the presence of a hunter in the dark, as somewhere across the city, Gerald Stokes is making his own calls that are being answered on the first ring. Feels. And in the center of it all was Evelyn Blake. For 2 decades, she had built a fortress around her soul, a life engineered for a world of men she had learned were unworthy of trust. Now she felt a seismic shift. Feels. the very foundations of her existence cracking apart beneath her. The next hour would decide if that fortress held or crumbled into ruin. It took Frank's team 11 minutes to get there. Evelyn felt the time pass, heels, her mind retreating to the compulsive counting that brought her order as a girl. 11 minutes after Frank's call, her phone lit up. Just 2 words. Heels. She's safe. The air she hadn't realized she was holding rushes from her lungs in a raw, ragged sigh. A brutal, crushing wave of relief. She instantly reconstructs her composure. There are too many watchers in this room, heels, and any sign of weakness is a weapon she cannot hand them. She's safe, she tells Victor. He gives a single, sharp nod. He was close enough to have seen the screen, but she knew he hadn't looked. He had been counting the seconds with her, heels, a silent reflection of her own cold fear. Stokes didn't get to her, he states. Not yet, she corrects, the pragmatist clawing back control. We're moving faster than is yet, Victor answers. Heels. He gestures to Frank. The garret now. Frank is a ghost before the words even settle. From across the room, Hartman watches, his eyes darting to the frantic dance of Daniel's pen, a blur of motion on a page drowning in ink. Heels. The script itself is a compressed, desperate thing, the panicked scrawl of a man racing his own shadow to the gallows. Where do you think you're going? Hartman asks. To retrieve your weapon, Victor returns. I'm going with you, Hartman states. No, Heels. The word is a slab of granite, final and absolute. You will stay with him until it is done. The moment you leave his side, the words stop. That confession, the part that lives only in his memory, is the one thing Stokes cannot silence with a signature. Heels. Hartman's gaze falls on Daniel, a man burning alive in the fever of his own unburdening. You have 90 minutes, Hartman says. I'll need less, Victor promises, his eyes locking onto Evelyn. You, with me. It is a command, not a request. Heels. She grabs her coat. They move through the club's rear service exit. Victor, Evelyn, and Garrett. Garrett is a monolith of a man who has shadowed Victor for 9 years. Heels. Built on a foundation of silence and an unnerving talent for making complicated things disappear. In the slick, damp alley, the engine already hums. Inefficiency is a disease in Frank's world. They are in motion before the door has even fully latched shut. Heels. Where are we headed? Sixero, Victor says. A dry cleaner's on Cermak. Heels. It's mine, held for years through a corporate ghost. No lines lead back. For 11 years, a phantom account has existed there. The owner, Petrotov, keeps a storage space in the back. No one has ever stepped inside it but me. His eyes are fixed forward, Heels, watching the wipers sweep a thin drizzle from the windshield. The ledger has been in a fireproof box in that room for the last 8 months. Right after the wedding, Evelyn murmurs, connecting the pieces. 3 days after, he confirms. Heels. Stokes was there. He spent 40 minutes telling my daughter's new husband what a decent man I was. 40 minutes. An innocent man has no need for such a prolonged defense of his own character. Heels. He falls silent, letting the low hum of the engine fill the car. I didn't know what he'd done, not about the children. But I know the smell of a cover-up, and I knew when it all came down he'd need an offering. I decided it wouldn't be me, Heels. So you built yourself a way out for 8 months. I spent 8 months making sure I had options. He corrects, the difference vital. An exit is surrender. An option is a weapon. She studies his profile, Heels, cast in and out of shadow by the rhythm of the streetlights. The dash clock reads 4:17 a.m. In the pulsing dark, Victor Moretti is exactly what he appears to be. A man in his 60s who erected an empire on the choices of others, now facing the last, Heels, merciless accounting of his soul. He does not look broken. Heels. A man like Victor Moretti would never allow you the satisfaction of seeing him break. But the man in this car was more tangible, more real than the monolith she had met only 4 hours ago. He was flesh and blood now, no longer a monument to power. For her, Heels, that shift opened a perilous fissure in her own defenses. My mother, she begins, the words escaping a fortress she had built during the 40-minute drive, a fortress that was now crumbling. What you said about Stokes, the warehouse, Heels. 14 years ago? That's correct, he says. Are you saying she was investigating him? I am saying that theory aligns with the facts as we now know them, he replies, each word chosen with the precision of a scalpel. Heels. What is undeniable is that she was inside that warehouse looking for something. The men who found her, Daniel's men, said she was holding papers. Heels. Papers. What they contained, we'll never know. The order that followed, however, was savagely simple. Get the documents and make sure their source could never speak again. The sentence hung in the charged air of the car. Heels. The story I was sold was that she worked for a rival. that she was a threat to everything I had built. That was Daniel's version. For 20 years, that was the world I lived in. And you believed him? Evelyn's question was a sharpened edge. Feels. He was the one man I trusted without question, Victor answers. That is the cost of trust. It can be reshaped into a blade to be used against you, and you won't see it until it's already in your back. My mother was a paralegal, Evelyn says. Feels. Her voice hollow. 16 years at a small firm, corporate and real estate law. She seems to drift away for a moment. As a kid, I never understood the hours she kept. Feels. I thought it was the job, the pressure to bill every minute. A breath, a pause. But if she was unraveling Stokes's shell corporations through property records, that's exactly the data she would have seen. Feels. A paralegal in a quiet downtown office. Who would ever see her as a threat? Who would warn her off? A terrifyingly accurate assessment, Victor says, his voice low. She wasn't a random casualty, Evelyn continues. Feels. The brutal framework of the past assembling itself in her mind. She was close. Someone tipped off Stokes, and Stokes gave the order to Daniel. That is the shape of it as I see it now, Victor agrees. The car sliced through the city's empty, pre-dawn arteries. A full minute of silence passed between them. When this started, Evelyn finally says, I was certain you were the monster at the end of the story. Feels. I know, Victor says. I walked in expecting nothing less. I know. She watches his face in the intermittent glow of the streetlights. You are not a good man, Victor. No, he agrees. The word immediate, stripped of all artifice. I am not. Feels. But Stokes is something else, she ventures. Stokes is an entirely different species of evil, Victor corrects her. He is a man who decided long ago that the rules of society were for other lesser people. Men like me, we operate outside the law. Feels. It's a known quantity. There's a grim honesty in that. But Stokes wraps himself in the law. He helps write the law. He uses the very shield of justice as his primary weapon. That, he pauses, letting the weight of it fill the space, Feels, is a truly different kind of darkness. Feels. Evelyn lets this sink in. She processes the 20 years she spent building a case against the man she thought was the singular architect of her life's defining tragedy, only to be sitting here, in this car, Feels. Understanding the real cancer was higher up the food chain than she'd ever dared to look. If Hartman pulls this off, she asks, if he dismantles Stokes's entire network, and this all holds up, what happens to you? Victor is quiet for a beat. That, Feels, he says, depends on whether Hartman is a man of his word. If he holds to our agreement, limited immunity, a formal record of my testimony, Feels, his support for what comes next, I might see 18 months before some other ambitious prosecutor takes a shot at the file. Maybe 2 years, Feels. And then, he says, I will have to figure out how to live out what's left. He delivers the line with a flat, clinical distance utterly devoid of pity, like a man reading a weather forecast. I have a daughter, Feels. She has no idea about the true scope of my world. She knows just enough to have married a man from Denver, to have put 1,200 miles of clean air between her life and Chicago. She is still my daughter, and my choices built that wall, Feels. It's a reality that has stood for far too long. Evelyn says nothing. I am not asking for your pity, he clarifies. I am giving you a clinical profile of the man I am outside of this moment, because you have a right to know who you've thrown in with. Feels. I know who I've thrown in with, she answers. Feels. Do you? Yes, she says, her voice a sudden hard thing. A man who used his own body to shield a stranger. A man who had the instinct to hide a ledger 8 months ago, based on nothing but the smell of rot in the air and the discipline to wait. Feels. And a man who listened to me argue for 40 minutes when it would have been easier to just walk away. Her words hang in the space between them. That doesn't make you a good man, Victor, but it makes you an entirely different kind of man. He doesn't reply, Feels, but the slightest shift in his shoulders, a barely perceptible release of tension, is an acknowledgement. The car slows to a stop. Garrett's voice is a low rumble. We're here. Victor speaks. Stay with the car. He turns to Evelyn. 2 minutes. Feels. A side door. The owner, Petrov, a man in his 70s built like a sea crate, who shows no surprise at a 4:30 a.m. summons, has the profound weariness of someone long past being shocked by anything. Feels. He leads them in silence past the hanging garments to a back storeroom. From there, Victor moves from a map drawn in his own mind, a grim and silent ceremony. He slides a specific metal shelf exactly 18 inches to the left. Feels. The movement exposes a patch of wall scored with a nearly invisible seam. Victor presses 2 points in sequence. A hidden panel gives a soft click and swings inward. Feels. Inside rests a fireproof steel box, matte black, about the size of a large artist's portfolio. He takes it. They are back in the car in less than 4 minutes. He hands the case to Evelyn. Its unexpected weight settles into her lap. 11 years. Feels. She whispers, the words trying to encompass the immense span of this buried life. 11 years, he repeats. Her eyes are locked on the case as if the entire psychic weight of her life has been compressed into this single object. Inside is the truth, feels. The names, the blueprint of a shadow world. Inside is the origin point of her life's great trauma, her mother's death, the one event from 2 decades ago that hammered her into the woman she is today. Feels. Stokes is finished, she said. The words a quiet prayer that this new proof would finally seal their case. A slow nod from Victor, yes, and everyone he shields. His analysis of how such empires fall was dispassionate, cold. Feels. An organization like his never collapses cleanly. It shatters. The outer layers feel the core giving way, and the agents scramble for their own survival. He gestured to the case. This, though, this is the catalyst, the first crack in the foundation. Feels. The stillness broke with a call from Hartman, his name glowing on the screen. We have a problem, Hartman said, his voice a taut wire of professionalisms, stretched thin over a chasm of raw stress. Daniel went dark 20 minutes ago. Feels. He asked for water. I gave it to him. I looked away, and he had Mateo's phone. A numbing cold seeped into Evelyn's bones. He made a call. Just one, Hartman clarified. Mateo got the phone back almost immediately, but he made a connection. Feels. It lasted 42 seconds. Who did he call? Victor asked, his attention now a laser. An untraceable number. Mateo's trying to track it, but he called Stokes, Evelyn stated, the truth landing like a stone in her gut. Feels. That's my working theory. What was said? Victor demanded. We only have a piece of it, something about a place, and a mention of R. He paused. A name, Cicero. The word detonated in the car's crushing silence. Feels. Victor's eyes found Evelyn's, a silent shared acknowledgement that catastrophe was no longer a possibility. It was already in motion, he knew, Victor said, the 2 words confirming a fear he'd buried long ago. He knew about Petrov and the storeroom. Feels. How could he? Evelyn demanded, the question raw. 11 years back, when I set this up, Daniel was the fail-safe, the only one I trusted with the location if something were to happen to me. A muscle jumped in his jaw. Feels. I told him I'd moved the ledger 8 months ago. I never gave him the new location, but if Stokes has had Daniel for 2 years, the thought hung in the air, a venomous, unfinished thing. Feels. If Stokes had 2 years to bleed Daniel dry. They know about Petrov, Evelyn whispered. Feels. They might not have the exact spot, but they have the target. Some business in Cicero with a connection to you. Garrett, Victor's voice was sharp. ETA to the Meridian? 12 minutes, came the reply from the driver's seat. Go, Victor commanded. Feels. The car lunged forward. Evelyn clutched the heavy case, her eyes darting between mirrors, searching for a car that didn't belong, knowing it was useless. Feels. A man who thrived in the shadows for 16 years wouldn't use something as crude as a tail to find them. Hartman, she said, lifting the phone again. Feels. Stay on this line, she ordered, her voice cutting the tension. Get Daniel away from Mateo. Put him somewhere he can't be reached by God himself, and get every federal agent you can to the Meridian. You have 15 minutes. Feels. I can't just manifest that kind of federal presence without probable cause. Then create it, she shot back. You're an assistant U.S. attorney with a file that could end a senator. Use it. Use every bit of it. Feels. Call your supervisor, the one who doesn't know where you are, and tell him everything now. Because if Daniel broke and Stokes is coming, the next 20 minutes will decide it all. Either we bring a case on Monday or this night, and every one of us in it, Feels, will be erased from history. Feels. A heavy silence filled the space between them. I'm on it, Hartman finally said, and the line went dead. Victor's eyes were still on her. You're putting a lot of faith in that man. No, Evelyn said. Feels. I'm betting that his need to destroy Stokes is stronger than his need to save himself. Tonight, that's enough. But as they neared the Meridian 8 minutes later, the scene was wrong. A black hole where there should have been light. Feels. Every exterior lamp on the building was dark, and she knew for a fact one of them was working when they left. Frank Caruso stood on the sidewalk, a statue with a phone pressed to his ear. Feels, his face a mask of professional calm that failed to conceal the panic coiling inside him. Feels. It was the look of a man watching his world come apart at the seams, trying to hold it together with sheer force of will. The car was still gliding to a halt as Victor moved, the door swinging open. Frank. Power's out for the whole block, Frank said. Heels, his voice tight. Went down about 15 minutes ago. Looked like a city crew. My guys found a tampered junction box a street over, and a van, no plates, 2 blocks east. Who's with them? Victor pushed. Hartman and Daniel are in the back office. Heels. Moved them there when the lights went. I've got 3 of my men with them. Stokes people, Evelyn said, her voice low, absolute. This isn't an assassination, it's an extraction. They're here for Daniel. Victor turned to her. Heels. Why take him when they could just? Because a dead Daniel is a martyr with a sworn affidavit. Heels. A Daniel who vanishes is just a man who went missing, she finished, whose testimony dies with him, thrown out of court as something you fabricated. Stokes doesn't want him dead. He wants him erased. The van? Frank, the location. Victor started. Heels. Then stopped himself. Frank rattled off the coordinates. Victor's eyes met Garrett's. A silent question asked and answered with one curt nod. Garrett moved like smoke, 2 other shadows peeling away from the building to join him. Heels. Evelyn watched them disappear. A sudden, chilling glimpse into Victor's other life. A world of men who solve impossible problems with a language of brutal finality she could only ever witness. She turned to follow Victor into the suffocating dark. Heels. The back office felt like a tomb, heavy with the smell of decaying paper and the ghosts of cigarettes smoked decades ago. Hartman stood braced against a wall, phone fused to his ear, his briefcase held like a shield. Heels. Daniel Cross was a hollowed-out shape in the corner, one of Victor's men a motionless silhouette behind him. Daniel's face was utterly blank, the expression of a man who has just far too late understood the full, ruinous scope of his own actions. Heels. The gamble he made 20 minutes ago had just cost him everything. Hartman hung up. My supervisor is coming, he told the room. 2 agents, 12 minutes out. Too slow, Victor said flatly. Stokes already has people in place. They're outside. Heels. A flicker of genuine fear finally cracked through Hartman's composure. How many? We are about to find out, Victor replied. From his corner, Daniel's voice rose, a dead, broken thing. I didn't tell him about you, just the ledger. Cicero. That's all. Heels. It was enough, Evelyn said. I know, Daniel whispered, staring at his own trembling hands. I know. Victor held him in a long, silent regard, a moment weighted with the history of 2 decades. This wasn't friendship anymore, Heels. Not after a betrayal this deep. It was something far worse, a bond of trust that had curdled into this, 2 men at the end of a shared life, facing their own separate reckonings. You are going to finish that statement, Heels. The command was final. Every name, every single deal you know Stokes made, you will put on that paper. You will sign it. You will give it to Hartman before those agents walk through that door. And if I do? Daniel started, Heels, a pathetic sliver of hope in his vacant eyes. If you do that, Victor cut him off. What happens to you is no longer my problem. But you will face it with a signed confession and one last act of penance to your name. It's more than you deserve, Heels, and it's a hell of a lot better than where you were 10 minutes ago. Daniel's gaze fell to the legal pad on the desk. His hand reached for the pen. He began to write. Evelyn set the fireproof case on the table. It landed with a soft, Heels, heavy finality in the charged quiet. The ledger, she said. Heels. 11 years of his business. Every name, every date, every payment. She let the words hang in the air. It has Stokes with records that go back before the terminal files. It also has the deeds for the warehouse on the south side. Heels. The place my mother was killed 14 years ago. A direct link to his network, proving he used that building to make people disappear. Hartman's gaze shifted from the case to her face, a new profound understanding in his eyes. Heels. You know what you're giving up. I know exactly what I am giving up, she replied, her voice solid as stone. I have known for 20 years. Hartman laid a hand on the case. This will be enough, he said, his voice a near whisper. With this, Heels, and Daniel's statement, sealed or not, we can break that classification to pieces. Heels. Everything in this box is sufficient for a grand jury indictment. His words hung in the air, heavy as stone. It is enough to reduce his entire world to cinders, a dry clearing of a throat. I'm aware. Evelyn's response landed, flat and cold, outside, Heels. The stillness was shattered by a sharp, violent clang of metal on metal, not gunfire, something heavier. Then came the deep groan of a struggling engine, followed by the tortured shriek of tires clawing for purchase on asphalt, a faint snort. Evelyn's hand, Heels, at her side, clenched into a white-knuckled fist, grasping at nothing. Victor's phone buzzed against the table. He looked at the screen, and the hard ridge of his jaw seemed to lose its tension by a fraction. Garrett, he said, his voice low. Heels. The van is gone. A silence. We have 3 hostiles. Moving on foot, another silence. No engagement. For the second time in a single night, Evelyn felt the painful release of a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Heels. They realized their opportunity was gone, she stated, a final judgment. Stokes made a tactical mistake, Victor countered, his voice a low growl. He never imagined Hartman could bring in federal resources so fast. His mistake was the first phone call. Heels, she corrected him. Every decision he's made tonight has been a reaction. This isn't his way. He's losing his discipline. Good, Victor breathed. It also means his next move will be something else entirely, she foresaw. And this time, Heels, it won't be quiet. Victor's gaze locked with hers. Let him try. That's an extraordinary amount of confidence, she observed. It is a practical assessment, he replied. Hartman has the ledger. Heels. Daniel is finishing his confession in. His eyes flicked to his watch. 8 minutes. At that exact moment, 2 federal agents will be here, and this room becomes their jurisdiction. Stokes can't touch it. Heels. His security clearance is limited to the terminal files. Heels. It doesn't extend to this. His swept through the air, indicating the box, the notepad, the very air in the room. He made his play, and it wasn't enough. Anything he tries now is born of desperation, and desperate men make mistakes. Heels. The chime from Hartman's phone cut through the quiet. He answered, listening for a full 30 seconds as an expression of grim finality settled over his features, drawing the gaze of everyone in the room. That was my supervisor, Hartman announced. Heels. What's the situation? Victor's voice was sharp. 40 minutes ago, Hartman began. Gerald Stokes submitted his resignation from the United States Senate. He claimed personal reasons. There will be no further comment. A profound silence fell. Heels, absorbing all sound. Then, without breaking the rhythm of his writing, Daniel Cross spoke to the surface of the table. He's running. He can't outrun this, Evelyn said. Heels. He's trying to, Hartman clarified, his focus now entirely on Evelyn. Resigning costs him some protections, but it doesn't erase the crime. In some ways, it makes prosecution simpler. Heels. We don't have to fight through the political mess of indicting a sitting senator. He held her gaze. He knows about the ledger. He knows Daniel is talking. He's trying to control the story. He is 16 years too late to control anything. Heels, she replied, her voice absolute. The door swung open and Frank Caruso stepped inside, his attention fixed on Victor. 2 feds at the door. They're asking for Agent Hartman. A throat was cleared. Hartman straightened the hang of his suit jacket. Heels, a quiet ritual of preparation. Heels. He lifted his briefcase. He took the fireproof box into his custody. He turned to Victor Moretti, a name that for 2 decades had been a ghost haunting federal cases across Illinois, and spoke. I meant what I said before, about our understanding. Heels. I know you did, Victor affirmed. This is where things get difficult. There are people in my office who will hate these terms. My entire life has been a series of deals with men who hate the terms, Victor answered. Heels. The barest shadow of a smile flickered across Hartman's lips. For some reason, I find that incredibly easy to believe. His gaze shifted, landing on Evelyn. I will need you to join me. There are parts of this that these agents need to hear from you. Heels. She gave a single sharp nod. Her eyes remained on Victor Moretti, a king surveying the silent, ruined landscape of his kingdom. A jazz club at 5 a.m. on the precipice of a federal storm. His eyes found hers. In them, Heels. He saw the woman who had walked in 6 hours ago with only a question, a box of yellowed files, and 2 decades of unforgiving patience, and had taken his world apart piece by piece to find her own. His voice was almost a whisper. Heels. You have what you came for. Not yet, she corrected, each word precise. Not until it's finished. It will be finished, he promised. It will take time, but it's going to happen. She held his stare for another heartbeat. Heels. Then turned and walked out behind Hartman. In the echoing quiet they left behind, Victor Moretti collapsed into the last chair in the room, rested his elbows on his knees, and for the first time he could remember, did nothing at all. Heels. He just sat. He breathed in the stale air. All around him, the night finally gave up, an old predator that had hunted itself to exhaustion. The only sound was the scratch of Daniel Cross's pen, charting the map of his own ruin. Outside, Heels. The solid black of the horizon was just beginning to give way, bleeding into a bruised, hopeless gray. It wasn't the dawn, but the promise of it, that fragile moment when the darkness thins right before it breaks. And below it all, Chicago waited, Heels. Just as it always had, a city in suspension, waiting to see what new monster the light would reveal. In the narrow hallway at 5:14 a.m., Agents Reyes and Doherty wore the placid masks of their trade as Hartman brought Evelyn before them. Heels. Reyes was a compact woman in her 30s with searing eyes that seemed to take the entire scene apart in under 4 seconds. Doherty, older, maybe 50, had a deliberate stillness, Heels, the kind of absolute economy of motion a man learns when he stops wasting energy on anything that does not serve his primary objective. Their questions were like scalpels, Heels. Evelyn gave them the answers she had spent 2 decades honing in the prison of her own mind, answers that were polished, hard, and without a single flaw. She walked them through the timeline of the documents, her methods of searching, and the perfect, Heels, unbroken chain of custody for every file now in Hartman's hands. She laid bare the national security order, the terminal records, and articulated with chilling precision why the ledger was on an entirely different legal plane, Heels, beyond the reach of that command, Heels. And then she raised the subject of her mother. In the silence that followed, Reyes's pen stopped moving. Are you claiming there is a connection between the 2004 homicide of Margaret Blake and the criminal enterprise we are investigating? Heels, Reyes asked. I am claiming the documents prove it, Evelyn answered, her voice a flat line, utterly devoid of feeling. Whether that meets your standard for prosecution is for the lawyers to decide. But yes, that is precisely what I am claiming, Heels. Reyes and Doherty exchanged a brief, loaded glance. The latter was now completely focused on his notes. Messrs. Blake, Doherty began, I need you to clarify your role here. Heels. You have conducted a private investigation into Senator Stokes for 3 years, with the help of... For 20 years in total, she corrected him. The first few years were preparatory. Heels. Preparatory? Doherty repeated the word as if it were foreign. I was developing a particular set of skills, she explained. A process of that nature takes time. Doherty wrote something down. Heels. And your contact at the shipping firm. The individual whose safety was in question? She's safe, Evelyn said. Victor Moretti's people have her. She'll need official protection as a material witness. Heels. I'm telling you to make that your first priority after we are done here. Reyes was already working her phone. From the doorway, Hartman's voice sliced through the hall. The subject, Bert Bond, also known as Daniel Cross, Heels, has finished his written statement. Doherty stood. I'll take it. He slipped out the door. Heels. Evelyn heard the thin, hollow sound of Daniel's voice from the other room, the sound of a man who, after hours of confessing, had nothing left inside him to build a defense. The door clicked shut. The corridor now held only 3 people. Evelyn, Reyes, Heels, and Hartman. Reyes spoke. You need to know. Gerald Stokes' lawyer made contact with our office 40 minutes ago. They're claiming the ledger was obtained illegally. They plan to file a motion to suppress any evidence that comes from it. Heels. It was the move she expected, as certain as the storm that breaks after a long day of watching the sky turn black. The ledger is the personal property of Victor Moretti, she stated. Heels. That evidence was provided willingly as part of a cooperation agreement that was already in place with Hartman. Any claim of illegal procurement has no legal basis. Reyes's face was a blank canvas. Stokes' lawyer is going to make the argument anyway. Heels. He's going to make every argument he can. Evelyn's response was swift. He's paid to. But Hartman has built this case for 3 years. The ledger's origin is airtight. Daniel's statement supports it. Heels. And my documents will survive any fight over classified material. The way they were found is unimpeachable. A beat of quiet. Stokes resigned an hour ago. His lawyer is doing exactly what he is, trying to delay, to bury, to create chaos. Heels. It's a useless tactic against the sheer mass of what we have. Reyes just watched her. You've rehearsed this. I have rehearsed every possible version of every conversation in this building for a very long time. Evelyn confirmed. Heels. The faintest hint of a smile touched Reyes's mouth. It was there, then gone. We'll need a formal deposition, she stated, inside the next 48 hours. Your full account, on the record, counsel present. I'll be there, Evelyn confirmed. Heels. You are required to stay in Chicago, Reyes told her, until we've finalized witness protection for your source and determined the complete scope of your involvement. I'm not planning on going anywhere, Evelyn said. Reyes gave a single, Heels, sharp nod and retreated down the corridor. Hartman waited until she had vanished from view before stepping closer. How are you holding up? He asked, his voice kept low. Evelyn just gave him a look. He was the only soul who truly knew what she had done, Heels, and what it had cost having spent 3 years watching her and daring to ask the questions nobody else could have ever imagined. Heels. He was the one witness to the life she had been forced to build. I'm stable, Evelyn said. I am functional, she corrected herself. And for tonight, that's the same thing. He got it. He knew her well enough to hear the fine line she was drawing in the sand. Heels. That deposition will be brutal, he warned her. Putting your mother's history on the official record like that. I'm very aware of what will be asked of me, she shot back. This isn't new ground. It doesn't need to be a weight you carry by yourself. Heels. Her eyes met his. James, I have carried this by myself since I was 17. I know precisely how to manage it. He let a moment pass. What you did tonight was extraordinary, he said. Heels. It's critical that you hear that from someone who saw it happen. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes fell to the floor, then rose to meet his once more. It's not finished, she said. Don't offer me praise until the ending is written. Understood, Heels, he said, and then he was gone, vanishing back through the office door. She was alone in the hallway, truly, completely alone for the first time in the 9 hours since she'd walked into the Meridian, and she let herself feel a piece of it, not all of it. Heels. No corner of her mind was safe enough to hold all of it just yet, but a sliver, the knife's edge. The truth that her plan had worked perfectly, and that her plan had also gone catastrophically off the rails. Both things were true, Heels, and she was somehow still on her feet. Heels. She pushed off the wall and started back toward the club's main room. Victor was right where she'd left him, sitting with his forearms on his knees. His head came up as she approached. Frank Caruso sat in a chair facing him. Heels. The rest of the men had pulled back to the edges of the room, the way soldiers do when they're waiting on fresh orders. The fireproof box was gone, with Hartman now. The legal pad with Daniel's confession was gone too. All that was left was the room, Heels, the men inside, and that profound in-the-bone silence that comes after the end of an operation. Stokes's lawyer is filing a motion to suppress the ledger, she said. A dry, clinical sound that was almost a laugh came from Victor. Heels. A motion he has zero chance of winning. That's right, she agreed, he won't. She took the chair opposite his. Frank had already stood and faded back without being told. Rise is going to need your cooperation on the deposition, Heels. Your testimony on the ledger's chain of custody and how it was transferred. I'll cooperate, Victor stated flatly. They're going to attack the deal itself, she went on. Stokes's people will argue you were coerced, Heels, that Hartman used the trafficking charges to strong-arm you into an agreement you never would have taken otherwise. Hartman didn't force a thing, Victor said. I made the first move. I know, she replied. Heels. It's absolutely vital you make that clear on the record. It will be made clear, he vowed. She watched him for a beat. There's something else. He didn't speak, just waited. The documents about the warehouse, she started. Heels. Once they're entered into evidence, once my mother's death becomes part of that chain, it all goes public. The press will get their hands on it. The details of how she died, the how, the why, the who, it will all come out. Yes, Victor acknowledged. Heels. Frank was there, she said. From across the room, Frank Caruso's body tensed, a nearly invisible tightening, but he remained silent. I know, Victor said. Hartman will need his statement too, she said, about that night. What he saw, what he did, Heels, and what he didn't do. Heels. I know, Victor said again, the words quiet and absolute. His gaze, heavy with consequence, shifted to Frank. Frank, the older man, came forward, taking his place before them like a character in some ancient play. Heels. Having fought his war with memory in the wings, and now stepping into the light to speak a final terrible truth, he cleared his throat. I'll give the statement, he said. His voice scraped raw with the burden of that decision. All of it. Heels. Whatever Hartman needs. Evelyn's focus was a laser on him. That will mean charges filed against you, she noted, the statement a cold, hard fact dropped into still water. You understand that? I understand, Frank exhaled. I'm 73, Heels. I got 30 more years than your mother did, I understand. She held his gaze, a silent, unyielding line between them. There was no pardon she could offer. She had told him that already. Heels, a plain truth that was less a judgment than a brutal reflection of her own brokenness. Heels. Yet a strange, hollow feeling of an ending began to form as she watched this man, a specter from the genesis of her life's deepest wound, choose, here at the end of everything, to etch its truth into the official record. Heels. There was no word for a moment like this. Okay, she finally whispered. Okay, he repeated, a pact sealed in the silence. Victor said there was something I've kept from both of you. He spoke slowly, like a man who'd been holding his last trump card, Heels. Not for his own advantage, but for the one moment its reveal could change the entire board, a moment that was now here. Evelyn watched him, a figure carved from ice. The papers your mother had on her, he began. Deals. The ones they found with her body in that warehouse. Daniel told everyone they were taken and burned. That was the story he fed me 20 years ago, and that's the story I decided to believe. Yes, she confirmed. Deals. 2 years ago, Victor's voice cut through the thick air. Daniel came to me with a business proposition to buy out a foreclosed storage unit in Bridgeport. Deals. It was a standard play. The lien was paid. The unit became I sent a man to take inventory. He stopped, letting the silence stretch. Inside was a single box, sealed with tape. That box held documents, financial statements, property deeds, deals, articles of incorporation. I didn't think much of them. They were documented and filed away. That's my procedure for all assets. Evelyn was so still she seemed to be frozen in time. When I moved the ledger 8 months ago, Victor went on, deals. I did a full audit of all my secure assets, including that box. His eyes locked on hers, pinning her in place. They were your mother's files, Evelyn. Daniel never destroyed them. He hid them. Deals. For 20 years, he kept them. A final weapon, maybe. An insurance policy for a day when he was trapped and had no other moves left. He never used them, never burned them. They just waited, suspended. What was in those files? She asked. Deals. Her voice a fragile thread. Everything, Victor answered, his tone soft and devastating. A flawless, unbroken trail of evidence linking 6 of Stokes's shell companies through a web of real estate deals going back 18 years. Deals. Your mother's handwriting was in the margins. Her notes about what each deal meant. Questions she was still chasing. Names she had circled in red. He let that sink in. She was weeks, maybe days. Deals. Away from building a case so airtight she could have taken it to someone with real power. The sheer magnitude of it wasn't a thought that formed in Evelyn's mind. It was a physical force that drove the air from her lungs. Deals. Her mother wasn't just a casualty. She hadn't stumbled into the line of fire by mistake. She'd been fighting the exact same war Evelyn had been fighting for 2 decades. Building a case, piece by excruciating piece. Deals. Tracing the money as it bled through the defenses built by men like Stokes. But she'd fought it alone, with no Hartman, with no Victor, with no 20 years to forge her soul into a weapon for the battle. A paralegal. Deals. Working out of a small real estate firm, for reasons Evelyn was only now beginning to grasp and would likely take a lifetime to truly understand. 3 weeks from winning. And then somebody warned Stokes. Where are the documents now? Deals. Evelyn's voice was a chillingly perfect instrument of calm. Deals. A choice was made in the span of 30 seconds. She would not let this truth shatter her. Not here. Not tonight. It would be taken, locked away in the airtight vault where all the other wounds were kept, the key swallowed deep within her. Deals. She would face it later, alone, when she could withstand the full force of its devastation. The ledger box, Victor said. They're in there. Hartman has them. She gave a single curt nod. He would grasp their meaning the second he laid eyes on them. Yes, Deals. Victor added. I made sure they were marked, separated from everything else. She watched him. You've known this for 8 months? I have. And you said nothing. I didn't know who I was waiting for, he confessed. Or what? Deals. But I knew there was a final act. I needed the lead to be holding every card when the curtain rose. Deals. You could have just given it to Hartman, she challenged. I could have, he conceded. But I have no trust in a system without an agent inside it. Someone whose need to see justice done comes from a place deeper than professional ambition. He paused. Deals, his focus intensifying. Your mother had that. It's what she gave you. You had to be in this room. It was the only way this could end. Evelyn stared at the man before her, the one she'd spent 2 decades casting as the villain in her own story. Deals. The man who designed her pain, now showing himself to be something else entirely. Something far more complex, so much more human. Deals. The story she built to keep herself alive was starting to splinter. This wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was a seismic redrawing of her entire world. It was the understanding that the real world is infinitely messier than the simple. Deals. Black and white narrative a 17-year-old girl needed to believe to escape an alley with nothing but a photograph. This new, brutal complexity didn't heal the wound or pardon the sins against her, but it changed the nature of the ending. Deals. Just wasn't the clean, noble vision of a teenager. It was this. This room, these broken people, this slow, ugly, grinding machine of truth. Her phone buzzed, a violent tear in the tense quiet. Hartman, she answered. Deals. I'm looking at the container's contents now, he said. His voice had a different quality, a strange hum between professional astonishment and raw fury, the sound of a man finding a holy relic he thought was lost to myth. Deals. Evelyn, you have the Adair case files. I'm aware of what's in there, she replied. A beat of silence hung on the line. Your mother, he said, the two words landing with impossible weight. Yes, she built the exact same case, he said. Heels. 18 years ago, from a totally different angle, using different sources, and she saw Evelyn, her work is more detailed. The web of shell corporation she uncovered goes 3 layers deeper than ours. Heels. Her notes have names, names that are nowhere in our files. How does this affect our case? She asked. It doesn't change the foundation, he replied. The case was already ironclad. Heels. But the names in her notes, 2 active federal judges in this state, are listed as beneficiaries of one of Stokes's shell accounts. Heels. This isn't just another piece of evidence. This is the linchpin. The entire reason for the national security order tonight. It's Stokes's creature. Hartman, Victor's voice was a low rumble, positioned just close enough to hear. What are the names? Heels. Hartman told him. Frank Caruso seemed to collapse, a marionette whose strings were suddenly cut, sinking into a chair. Victor didn't even flinch. But his face changed, hardening into a mask Evelyn had never witnessed. It was distant, frigid, Heels, utterly private. It was the look of a man discovering a cancer he thought was contained had already metastasized to the very bones of the system meant to save him. The national security order is null, Evelyn stated. It's compromised. Heels. That's right, Hartman confirmed. A judge with a vested financial interest signing a protective order for that same financial interest isn't a legal proceeding. It's obstruction of justice. That means the terminal archives are no longer under seal, Heels, which means everything is on the table. She finished for him. Correct, he said. Rise is already on it. By 800 tomorrow morning, every document at the Calumet terminal becomes admissible evidence with a clean chain of custody, Heels. Any move to suppress it is already dead. Stokes just lost the only move he had left that could have saved his skin. She added, he'll run. Already tried, Hartman said. His passport was flagged at O'Hare 40 minutes ago. Heels. He's confined to his Kenilworth estate. Federal agents have the perimeter locked down. Evelyn closed her eyes for a count of exactly 3. When she opened them, nothing in the room had moved. The people were frozen, Heels, but the very fabric of their reality had been torn apart and sewn back together in its final irreversible shape. What's my next move, she asked. Nothing, Hartman told her. Find a chair. Sit. I'll be in touch at 0800. The line went dead. Heels. Victor watched her. She met his gaze. It's over, she said. Give me the report, he commanded, and so she did. She laid it all out. The judges, the voided order, the terminal archives being cracked open, the flagged passport, Heels, the federal net closing tight around Stokes's home. Heels. She delivered the truth with the same detached precision she brought to everything. Even here, in the pre-dawn quiet at 5:47, at the very end of the longest war of her life, Heels, she was someone who organized facts before she ever allowed herself to feel them. When she finished, Victor leaned his head back, his gaze lost on the ceiling. Frank Caruso braced his hands on his knees, forcing his breath into a steady rhythm. Heels. The silence in the room was a single, sustained, unbearable note. Then Victor's voice cut through it. Your mother laid the foundation. Yes, Evelyn said, and you built the house. A beat passed. Her mind had drifted to Margaret Blake, Heels, to the ink bleeding in the margins of the notes, the circled names, the questions left hanging for 2 decades. Heels. For 20 years, a sealed box sat in a storage unit in Bridgeport, a secret that outlived the man ordered to burn it. Because even a man like Daniel Cross, in some dark, twisted part of what passed for his conscience, Heels, could not bring himself to destroy it completely. 2 people built it, Evelyn said, her voice cutting the silence. She just didn't know she had a partner. Victor watched her, Heels, his expression that of a man who has wandered off a map and now finds himself in a foreign land, trying to make sense of the new and hostile landscape of his life. And the projection from this point, he asked. A deposition in the next 48 hours, Heels, she answered. Witness prep. I'd expect 6 months of federal hearings, maybe more. It all depends on how hard Stokes's lawyers decide to fight. Heels. She stopped there. Beyond that horizon, there was nothing, a blank space. She had never allowed her mind to map a future beyond this one singular goal. What comes after was a place she never planned to visit. I don't know, she confessed. Heels, the words tasting strange. I've been aimed at this one point for so long, I don't think I know how to aim at anything else. You'll learn, Victor said. You build things. You'll build something new. She glanced at him, a question in her eyes. Heels. Is that what you plan to do? My plan starts with a phone call to my daughter, he answered. In Denver. I'm going to tell her I want to see her to meet her kids. In person. Not through a camera. He paused. Feels. The weight of the confession filling the air between them. Feels. She has two of them. A boy and a girl. I have never been in the same room with them. Evelyn said nothing. That is its own kind of ruin, he said, speaking more to the space around them than to her. The kind that comes from building the wrong thing. Feels. It poisons the foundations of everything else, even the things you never meant to break. I understand, she said, her voice a near whisper. I'm sure you do, he replied. You have your own 20-year hole in the world. My mother's was bigger. Feels. I try to keep that particular truth in focus. Victor gave a slow, measured nod. He rose from the chair. He was a tall man, Feels, and his every gesture carried the deliberate weight of someone who learned long ago that even movement was a form of power. Even here, at the end of everything, that quality lingered, Feels. Not the authority he possessed 12 hours ago, the absolute power of a king, but something else, something broken and put back together differently. Feels. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment before taking it. There was no warmth, no ice. It was the handshake of two survivors of the same shipwreck, where the shared experience creates not a bond, but a stark, silent acknowledgement. Feels. I will be there for the deposition, he said. Whatever day Hartman sets, I'll be there. I know, she replied. He let go of her hand. He glanced at Frank. Frank rose. They walked to the door together. Feels. Two men who had occupied the same world for 40 years, now stepping across the border into a new one whose shape they did not know, a place they would have to learn to navigate one hard day at a time. Feels. Victor stopped in the doorway. He spoke to the shadows in the hall without looking back. For what it's worth, he said, she would have been immensely proud, not because you finished what she started, but because of how you did it. A quiet moment passed. Feels. She raised someone who could walk into the most dangerous room in Chicago and make the truth bend to her will. That is a powerful thing, Evelyn. She said nothing back. She stood there, just listening for the sound of the door shutting, for that final, Feels, definitive click. Only when it came did she move to the bar, the very spot where she'd stood 6 hours ago, and told a brilliant lie to bring down a 20-year kingdom, and pressed her palms flat on the cool mahogany, and just breathed. Feels. She let the image of her mother coalesce in the quiet of her thoughts, not the operation, not the intel, not the web of targets or the probability of failure, just the woman, the precise way her hand knew the curve of a mug, the sound of her voice. Feels. A phantom resonance from a morning lost to time. She saw the photograph Evelyn had lifted from that alley, the one that served as a secret talisman stitched into the lining of every coat she'd worn for 20 years. Feels. She slipped it from a pocket and laid it on the scarred wood of the bar. Margaret Blake stared back, 40 alive, utterly unaware of the end already written for her, yet toiling on borrowed time. Feels. Moving through the hollows of a world that systematically erased her, tracing money's path through the walls built by powerful men. She was taking on a machine she knew was bigger than her, with tools she had to know would break. Because a person, Feels, has to. Because there is no other choice. Evelyn slid the photo back into its hiding place. She pulled out her phone and called a number she'd guarded like a prayer for 2 decades. The therapist from a city where she'd lived as someone else. Feels. The woman who helped her build the fortress inside her mind and taught her how to survive there. The one who explained that the hardest part of living through it all isn't the horror itself. It's figuring out what to do when you're finally free. Feels. 3 rings echoed in the silence. Then a voice. She wasn't sleeping. Hadn't been for Evelyn said. I know, the therapist replied. I've been waiting. It's done was all Evelyn could breathe out. I'm somewhere quiet. A long, warm Feels. Simple quiet. Then it's time to find your way home, the therapist said gently, whatever that word means to you now. Feels. Come home. We'll discover what comes after together. Evelyn's eyes followed the architecture of the room, the long bar, the ghost-like glasses. A stage after the play has ended, silent and empty. Okay, she whispered to no one. Outside, Feels. The sky was just beginning to bleed from black to gray. The city's arteries were starting to pulse with life. In a sprawling Kenilworth mansion, Gerald Stokes stood watching federal cars crawl across his lawn, the final beats of his old life expiring. Feels. Miles off, in Denver, a woman named Maria was about to answer a call from her father, a first word spoken across a great silent chasm that had separated them for years. Feels. And deep inside a federal building, an agent named Hartman was cracking the seal on a fireproof vault, about to unearth the collected life work of two women spanning 2 decades. A mother who found the first loose string, and a daughter who pulled it until the whole rotten tapestry came apart, proving that justice, when it arrives, is never the salvation its pursuers imagined it to be. Feels. Evelyn Blake stepped out of the Meridian building and into the dawn of a city that had no idea its world had been irrevocably broken and remade while it slept. She went in as a ghost, an idea with no name or record. She walked out as herself, and here was the truth of it. After 20 years spent inventing a life just to survive the old one, the simple, quiet act of being herself again was the single most terrifying thing she had ever done.